When John Merritt rode back into town that spring morning, the dust rose behind him like a ghost that wouldn't quit, and every pair of eyes in Silver Creek turned to watch. He had been gone for months, gone after the cattle raids, after the fire that took his barn, after his own brothers laughed and said he'd lost his mind chasing dreams across the Apache lands. But now he returned, sunburned, hardened, and not alone. 2 women rode beside him, tall, proud, dressed in simple hides and turquoise beads that glimmered in the sunlight. Their dark hair flowed in the wind like river water, and though they spoke to no one, their presence silenced the street. John tipped his hat, his voice steady, when he said to the old stable hand, "Tell my kin I've brought home my family." The word spread faster than wildfire through the town. The Merritt family was well known, cattle lords, landowners, men who'd built their fortune with calloused hands and hard hearts. But even among them, John was the strange one, too kind to shoot a thief, too stubborn to bend to the rules. And now, when folks saw him walking through town with 2 Apache women at his side, heads shook, whispers turned bitter. "Shameful," one woman hissed outside the general store. "Ungodly," muttered the preacher. John's brother, Henry, spat in the dirt and said, "He's lost his senses. Ain't no blood of mine gonna mix with savages." But John didn't answer. He led the women, Naira and Taya, to the small ranch just beyond the river bend, the one the family had written off as worthless land. The house was old, half collapsed, and the corral had long since fallen apart. Yet, when the 3 of them stood there, the wind cutting through the cottonwoods, it felt like something alive again. That night, they sat by the fire, and John listened to their soft voices tell stories of horses that ran like thunder and spirits that guarded the valleys. He didn't understand all the words, but he felt the truth in them. Days turned to weeks, and people kept talking. The Merritt family refused to visit. Even the ranch hands quit muttering that the land was cursed. But John and the 2 sisters didn't flinch. They rebuilt the fences, mended the wells, and from the hills came wild horses, lean, fierce, beautiful beasts that seemed to follow Naira like shadows. One morning, Henry Merritt rode down to mock his brother, laughing at the broken corral and saying, "Guess your savages ain't much use without cattle." John didn't answer. He just pointed toward the ridge. There, like a moving river of muscle and dust, came more than 200 horses, stallions, mares, colts, all moving in rhythm, guided by the soft whistles of the Apache women. Henry's laughter died in his throat. "They're yours," he managed to say. John smiled faintly. "Ours." From that day on, the ranch began to breathe again. Naira trained the wild horses with patience that no white man had ever seen. Taya handled the breeding, turning chaos into order. Within months, the ranch that had been forgotten became the most talked about in 3 counties, and the same people who once mocked now tried to buy. John turned them all away. He didn't need their approval. It began with silence, the kind that hides behind smiles and Sunday prayers. John Merritt's ranch was thriving now, and every sunrise over Silver Creek seemed to prove his brothers wrong. The horses multiplied, the fences stood tall, and the songs of the 2 Apache women echoed through the valley like blessings on the wind. But envy has long roots in dry soil, and the Merritt family, proud and bitter, couldn't bear to watch the brother they had mocked rise above them. Henry, the eldest, sat in the saloon one evening with a glass of whiskey, his voice low as he spoke to Sheriff Cole and 2 ranch hands. "That land ain't right," he muttered. "Ain't lawful what he's done. Man can't marry 2 squaws and call himself a merit." The others nodded, their faces lit by lamplight and hate. "He's got something unnatural up there," another said. "Those horses come from nowhere. You ever see beasts that wild obey a whisper? They planned slow, like snakes in tall grass. First came the lies, whispers in town that Naira and Taya were witches, that they'd bewitched John and stolen the Merritt fortune. Preacher Harlan began preaching about sin and bloodlines, his sermons sharper than knives. Then the supplies stopped arriving. The blacksmith refused to shoe their horses. The banker delayed payments. It was as if the whole town had turned its back overnight. But John didn't break. Every morning he rose before dawn, riding the ridge with Naira and Taya, training colts, mending fences, and pretending not to hear the rumors that clung to him like dust. Still, the storm was building. One night, just past the harvest moon, John woke to the smell of smoke. Flames licked the edges of the barn, hungry and fast. He ran barefoot into the yard, shouting for help, but only the horses answered, screaming in terror. Naira and Taya rushed from the house, their faces streaked with soot. Together they cut the ropes, freeing the herd, driving the animals toward the river, while John fought the fire with bare hands. The barn collapsed in a shower of sparks, taking half their grain and tools with it. By dawn, nothing remained but ashes and silence. Henry rode up just as the smoke thinned, pretending surprise. "Terrible thing," he said, not meeting his brother's eyes. "Shame accidents happen to stubborn men." John stared at him, the soot still clinging to his hair, the veins in his hands swollen with anger. "Accidents don't ride in on your brand of horse," he said quietly. Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing and turned away. That day, John made a choice. He wouldn't beg for help, wouldn't run, and wouldn't fight his brothers in the open. He'd rebuild again. The 3 of them worked without rest. The women carried timber, mixed clay, rebuilt stalls, and within weeks the ranch rose from ruin like something. The winter winds rolled over Silver Creek like ghosts, carrying the scent of old grudges and gun oil. By December, the feud between John Merritt and his brothers had grown past whispers and glances. It had become open war. The Merritt name, once a symbol of pride, was now split in 2, one side bound by greed, the other by love. John's ranch stood isolated at the edge of the mesa, surrounded by herds of horses that shimmered in the frost like living silver. Each dawn, he rode the perimeter with Naira and Taya, their eyes sharp, their rifles slung low. The sisters moved like the wind itself, silent, graceful, deadly when needed. They had fought before, back when soldiers raided their villages and men thought the Apache would vanish quietly into history. Those men were wrong, and Henry Merritt was about to learn the same lesson. The first attack came before sunrise, a thunder of hooves from the north. 6 riders, masked and armed, shouting curses that split the cold morning air. John barely had time to shout before bullets tore through the fence posts. He returned fire, his rifle cracking like lightning. Naira darted behind the corral, her bow flashing with eerie precision, arrows hissing through the smoke. Taya, fearless as the desert sun, swung onto a Mustang's back, and drove the herd straight into the attackers, scattering them like leaves before a storm. When the dust settled, 2 men lay dead in the sagebrush, one wounded and crying for mercy. John recognized him. Tom, one of Henry's men. "Tell my brother," John said, voice low and steady. "Next time I won't let the wind warn him first." The man limped away, and for days after, the valley stayed quiet. But peace never lasts long in places built on pride. Henry gathered more men, drifters, debtors, even a few bounty hunters, promising them the horses and half the land if they'd finish what he started. He told them lies about witchcraft and gold buried under the ranch, feeding their greed like firewood. And so one night, when the moon was full and pale, they came again, this time 30 strong. The gunfire began at midnight, echoing across the plains like thunder. The house windows shattered, the corrals splintered. Yet inside, the 3 stood unbroken. John reloaded by candlelight, his face streaked with sweat and ash. Naira moved through the shadows, placing burning oil jars along the fence line. When the riders closed in, she struck the torch. The night exploded in light, a wall of fire roaring through the wind. Horses screamed and bolted, men cursed and fell. Taya rode out through the flames, her hair wild, her eyes glowing like embers. She moved like something not of this world, striking and vanishing in smoke. Henry saw her from a distance and shouted, "She's no woman, she's a spirit." But the bullet she fired said otherwise. When dawn came, the field was littered with broken rifles, burned saddles, and silence. John stood on the porch, rifles. When the snow finally came to Silver Creek, it didn't fall gently, it came like judgment. The white drifts covered the scars of war, the blackened fences, the blood-stained ground, and the graves that John had dug with his own hands. He marked each one with a simple wooden cross. No names, no words, just silence. The ranch stood eerily still, the horses huddled close in the valley, their breath rising in clouds against the frozen air. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Naira sat by the hearth, sewing a torn saddle strap, her fingers steady despite the bruises on her arms. Taya lay on a cot, pale and weak. A bullet had grazed her ribs during the last fight. John knelt beside her, changing the bandage with the tenderness of a man who'd seen too much loss to bear another. "She heal," Naira whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. "The spirits favor those who fight with truth." John nodded, but said nothing. He stared into the flames, seeing not fire, but faces, Henry's sneer, his father's cold eyes, the mocking townsfolk who once called him foolish. He had built this ranch from nothing, loved without shame, fought without fear, and yet his own blood had turned against him. The price of peace had come due, and it was paid in flesh. Days passed in grim quiet. The townsfolk didn't come near. They feared the land now. They whispered that the ranch was cursed, that strange lights danced over the mesa at night, that the Apache women called to spirits in the wind. But one morning, a lone rider appeared through the snow, a messenger from the town. John met him at the gate, his rifle across his chest. The man handed him a folded paper sealed in red wax. "From your brother," he muttered before riding off. John broke the seal with a shaking hand. It wasn't a letter, it was a deed, signed and stamped by the county judge. The Merritt family had filed claim to his land, calling him unfit. accusing him of harboring fugitives and practicing heathen rites. They meant to take everything: the ranch, the horses, even the graveyard where his friends slept. John's vision blurred with rage. That night he sat alone under the cottonwood tree where the wind never stopped moving. Naira came to him quietly, her face calm, her eyes glowing like amber in the firelight. "They take what they do not understand," she said softly. "They fear what they cannot break." John looked up, pain carved deep into his expression. "I've fought them with fire and gunpowder, and still they come." Naira placed her hand on his. "Then fight them with truth. The desert knows your heart, John Merritt. It will not forget you." The next morning he rode to town alone. Snow still fell, the streets half empty, shutters closed. He walked straight into the courthouse, threw the deed on the judge's desk, and said, "If my blood wants this land, they'll have to bury me in it." Henry was there too, smug and silent. "You'll get your wish, brother," he sneered. John turned, eyes cold as winter steel. "I already have. You're the one who's lost." The tension broke like glass. A gun flashed, a cry rang out, and when the smoke cleared, Henry Merritt lay bleeding on the courthouse floor. The storm rolled in from the west just before dusk, turning the sky the color of gunmetal and ash. Lightning split the horizon, and the wind howled through Silver Creek like an angry spirit that had waited too long for justice. John Merritt stood on the porch, his rifle leaning against the post. The snow from last week now melted into rivers of mud. Behind him, Naira packed supplies into a saddlebag, while Taya, still healing, brushed her horse with slow, steady strokes. The message had come at dawn. Henry's men were riding again, this time not for land, not for revenge, but for blood. "They're coming to end us," Naira said quietly. John's jaw tightened. "Then they'll meet the land that made us." By nightfall, the storm was in full fury. Thunder shook the valley. The horses stamped and snorted, their eyes wide with fear. Then, through the wall of rain, torches appeared, dozens of them, moving in jagged lines across the ridge. Men shouted, their voices swallowed by the wind. "Burn the witch's den." One cried, "End the Merritt curse." John took his position at the gate, his heart pounding like the hooves of 1,000 horses. The sisters joined him, Naira with her bow, Taya with a pistol strapped to her thigh. The first shots cracked through the rain. Bullets tore splinters from the porch post. John fired back, his rifle steady despite the storm. Each flash of lightning lit up chaos. Men charging through mud, horses screaming, torches hissing out in the downpour. Naira moved like a shadow, every arrow she loosed finding its mark. Taya, fierce and wild, rode out into the open field, drawing their fire away from the barn. Her horse slipped in the mud, but she clung on, turning the fall into motion, rolling, firing, vanishing into the darkness like smoke. John saw Henry among the riders, drenched, pale eyes full of madness. "You should have stayed gone, brother," he roared, firing wildly. The bullet grazed John's shoulder, but he didn't fall. He took a step forward, raised his rifle, and fired once. Henry's hat flew off, and his horse reared, throwing him into the mud. The storm seemed to pause, a heartbeat of silence amid chaos. Then came the roar of hooves from the east. 200 horses, the same herd the sisters had once tamed, came thundering through the rain, led by Naira's haunting whistle. The ground shook. Men screamed. The herd tore through the attackers like a living storm, scattering torches, trampling rifles. Lightning struck a nearby tree, sending fire across the field, turning night into a nightmare of light and sound. John reached Henry in the chaos. His brother lay in the mud, dazed, his revolver inches away. John kicked it aside. "You did this," Henry gasped, coughing blood. John shook his head slowly. "No, you did. The land remembers what you plant." Another flash of lightning, and when the light faded, Henry was gone, swept away by floodwaters rushing down from the hills. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The field was quiet again, only smoke rising from the wet earth. The survivors of Henry's gang had fled, leaving their dead behind. John stood at the morning after the storm was so still it almost hurt to breathe. The valley, once drowned in thunder and rage, now shimmered beneath a soft, silver mist. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, and the horses, those magnificent creatures that had charged like ghosts through fire, grazed quietly among the ruins. John Merritt walked barefoot through the mud, his shirt torn, shoulder bandaged, his every step heavy with what had been lost and what had somehow survived. The ranch that had once been mocked as the Apache's den now stood scarred but standing, every beam and board whispering of the night it refused to fall. Naira and Taya moved silently, gathering what could be saved: tools, blankets, broken saddles, a piece of mirror that had caught lightning's reflection and shattered. The sisters' faces bore the calm of warriors who had seen death and spoken to it without fear. John stopped near the old fence post, the same one where he had first met them years ago, two proud women from a world the white men tried to erase. He remembered the laughter of his brothers, the cruelty of townsfolk, the sneers when he said he loved them. He had chosen love over lineage, and in doing so, he'd gained something his family never understood: honor. The rising sun cut through the mist, bathing the valley in gold. Steam rose from the ground, and in its glow, the land looked reborn, alive. The Apaches believed the earth remembered everything: the blood, the kindness, the promises. John knelt and pressed his hand into the soil, feeling the pulse beneath. "You kept us," he whispered. Behind him, Naira placed a hand on his shoulder. "The land always remembers the ones who fight for it," she said softly. Taya smiled faintly, her arm still in a sling, her gaze distant. "And it forgets the ones who take without giving." The three stood in silence as the herd began to gather, 200 strong, their coats glistening like bronze in the sunlight. John had never seen anything so pure, so alive. Each horse moved with grace, circling them like guardians of the past. Naira stepped forward and whistled low, a haunting, melodic call that echoed across the plain. The herd responded instantly, lining up in formation, the air trembling with their power. John realized that these sisters weren't just ranchers' wives or survivors. They were legends, spirits of the land itself, and he had merely been the witness chosen to walk beside them. By noon, smoke from a new fire rose over the valley, not of destruction this time, but of rebuilding. Together, they began to repair the fences, raise the barn walls again, one nail, one plank, one memory at a time. Travelers passing through the months ahead would tell stories of a ranch where two Apache women ruled the valley and where the wind always carried the scent of rain. Some called it the Ranch of Spirits, Others whispered it was cursed, but those who dared to stay long enough would see 3 figures at dusk, tending to horses as the sky turned crimson. Years later, when John's hair had turned white, and his children ran barefoot through the same soil, the land still told the story of that storm, of blood turned to kinship, and hatred turned to legend. The valley thrived because once a rancher chose love over pride, and 2 Apache women taught him that the earth, like the heart, only truly belongs to those who honor it.